And next up we have the much-awaited Brexit and US politics session with Matt Sinclair, Sam Bowman, Zolan Ketz and Roy Bromfield.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to talk about Brexit and EU politics. We're going to talk about what's going on back in Europe. And I think it was Tyrion Lannister said to Daenerys Targaryen, "You're in the great game now, and the great game's terrifying." And there's something of that in Brexit and EU politics. I say this as a Leave voter. I had to admit being a Leave voter in Germany within 2 days of the vote, so I'll admit it much more happily in Australia 6 months or so later, a year or so later, the best part now. But I think you can have supported the UK leaving the EU while acknowledging that the stakes in the UK's engagement with the EU and in European politics were high and are higher. That there is a throne out there to be won, if that's not stretching my little analogy there too far, but that there are this huge potential for things to go wrong in Europe. There are huge risks in European politics. And we need to be alive to both of those and alive to the structure of the policy and political challenges facing Europe, because they will reverberate around the world, because there are commonalities with what's going on in other developed and developing economies. I want to just quickly speak to 3 areas. The first is speak quickly about trade. The second is about policy, how that might change. And the third is about politics in a deep kind of what's happening to the regimes and populism sense. So firstly, let's speak about trade. I think both the EU and the UK have a very strong interest in doing a reasonable free trade agreement when the UK leaves the EU. So I don't think we should be expecting a cataclysm. Doesn't mean a cataclysm can't happen. If there can be breakdowns. I mean, I think we saw with the Canada-Europe trade deal, the potential for last-minute spanners in the works of the EU doing a trade deal. Equally, the UK, there could be political problems. I wouldn't expect them, though. I think the other thing we saw with the Canada deal, and earlier with the Greek crisis, is that when a deal needs to get done, the minor parties who want to throw a spanner in the works tend to be either bought off or threatened out of blocking the deal. You tend to find that the majority interest in doing a deal tends to prevail. What deal is open to question? How good a deal? How far we lose trade liberalisation from the strong degree of liberalisation of EU-UK trade with the single market is yet to be determined. But, and this is where we come on to the implications for you guys, we can, I think, get a reasonable sense of what a given deal in Europe will mean for the UK's engagement with the wider world. And I think the way to think about it is that the UK's trade with the EU is perhaps trending to about 1/3 of its total trade over time. It's not there yet. It's considerably more than that now. But I think if you were to set a reasonable estimate of where it'll go in the medium term, trends for about 1/3. What that means is that you need roughly 1 unit, however you want to measure it, of improvement in trade liberalisation with the rest of the world for every 2 that you lose with the EU. Now, people have put numbers on that. People have done economic studies of that. And because the EU single market is exceptionally integrated, ordinary free trade deals ain't going to cut it. The UK going around and doing average quality trade deals with the rest of the world will not be enough to make up for likely increases in trade barriers with the EU. I think we should be optimistic about EU-UK trade, but even on an optimistic read, average trade deals ain't going to cut it for the UK. And what that means for countries like Australia is that the UK is going to be in the market for a standard-setting trade deal to match the best and in many areas go further than other major international trade deals. So if you're looking at this from particular sectors, if you're thinking about what the free market movement can do in Australia, I think look to the fact that winning an Australia-UK trade deal I do not think is a challenge. I think there's a lot of political will to do that on both sides. But I think winning a deal which sets a new standard for global trade deals, which pushes the boundaries of what's possible, is a project that we should be really excited about. Next, if we come on to policy, and I think this is one of the areas which maybe wasn't appreciated with all the heat and fire of the Brexit campaign, but it's one of the most important reasons why Brexit was necessary for the UK. The EU is having to be dramatically remade in order to make it work with these key institutions of the Eurozone and the Schengen zone. That's a common currency and a common border. That's the Eurozone crisis, as you've seen particularly in Greece, and the refugee crisis, as you've seen on the march during 2016. Both of those crises are crucial because they have the ability not just to wreck governments, but to wreck regimes, to bring in dramatic populism from the edges, either from what's described as the far left, the Syrizas, or the far right, the Austrian guy who became president in Austria, his name escapes me. It has the potential to bring in parties from outside what was thought possible before. And those two crises entail a dramatic remaking of the EU, which at the fundamental of why Brexit had to happen, besides some of these sorts of sillier debates that we got on both sides through the referendum, is that the UK, as a non-Eurozone member, as a non-Schengen member, was never going to be comfortable with those changes, was never going to live with those changes. We'd got to a point where the UK, as the only large, permanent non-member of those two blocs, had to find another path, and it was better to do it from a point of decisiveness and go looking for those wider trade relationships as I've just talked about, than to try and stumble along. Now, what's crucial, I think, to understand about our priorities that as well is that the other dynamic here is that the EU, in order to assert its relevance, is harmonising a lot faster in a lot more areas than it would have in the past. So if you look at areas from like the regulation of online platforms, to the regulation of vaping, to the regulation of drones, to the regulation to a common climate policy, there's a huge difference between what the EU used to do. Areas like trade, where people basically know the right answer, reduce tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade, to areas where the right answer for policy really isn't obvious, and where trying to harmonise too early risks calcifying the wrong decision. It's not that the UK is better at making these decisions, it's that an EU which struggles to change its mind, as any supranational organisation does, is going to stick by mistakes longer. I think climate policy is a classic example of that, sticking by policies that were failing for too long. The final area I just wanted to talk to, and I think that's where there's exciting work for the free market movement as well, in driving forward new responses to some of these new policy challenges, which the UK can now do more adaptively, working with domestic institutions. And the final area I wanted to talk about is the clash of populism, which will be on people's mind, and these deep regime challenges. Now, don't expect Le Pen to win in the French election. She's going to lose to Macron. There's no certainties in politics, but expect her to lose. But I think worry about what happens down the road. Worry about what happens in Italy with the five-star movements. Worry about what happens the next cycle, because the French presidency is at the moment set up to disappoint. And worry about what happens if Macron disappoints people and looks like everything a French populist hates, right? A classic in mold of the French bureaucrat presidents. So Giscard d'Estaing reinvented for a new generation. Worry about that because these populists are not your friends internationally. I know there is sometimes a temptation looking from outside, seeing policy you dislike, particularly in the EU, which doesn't get get the best press internationally, often doesn't deserve the best press internationally. But I say this as someone who advocates for the UK to leave. There is a huge difference between thinking the UK will do better leaving under a conservative government for all their many flaws, than thinking that Le Pen crashing France out of the Eurozone is going to make the world a better place. These are protectionist parties. They're deeply, deeply illiberal parties. They would find everything that's been said at this conference horrifying, right? These are the parties that are trying to double down on European protectionism to pretend that it protects a social model that can't work, and frankly of racism. And of deeply unpleasant attitudes, and others in this panel will talk about it. There are experts who are here on the rest of this panel in every part of these three areas I've talked about, and others besides. I don't want to kind of define the parameters for our talk too much. But like Sam Bowman and the ASI, one of the venerable and greatest of UK think tanks, and one that's taken wonderfully to adapting over time with the next generation, with their online presence, and have become and have a great voice to make as a neoliberal think tank opposed to Brexit. But I think kind of on the flip side of maybe the talk I've given. Mine was a sort of relatively moderate leave talk, I'd hope. I think yours is probably a relatively moderate remain talk, Sam. You're not. I think that's a fair. And I think. And then Zoltan, who's speaking as someone who was one of us, part of the free market movement, coming to conferences like this as a think tanker, and now has crossed the divide and is an MP, and is really on the front line of the fight against some of the nastier populists in European politics. And finally, Rory, who, as well as being at the Freedom Association, a brilliant organisation born out of confrontation with socialism in the UK, but now been at sort of the forefront of thinking on Brexit, particularly some work he did with Ian Murray that's been enormously influential. So I just close on, like, European politics is worth engaging with for Australians and internationally. I think there's the potential, both in engaging with the EU knows that it needs to deliver economically for its people. It knows that it needs to engage with improving economic policy, improving trade policy. It needs to deliver in order to assuage its populist concerns. And the UK is going to be out there in global debates over regulatory policy, global debates over trade policy, in a new way, which, while we should not be in any way blind to the risks, has enormous promise. So I would be excited about the role the UK can play in the world, and I think that engaging with Australia, and Australia is going to be a crucial, and others in the region, is going to be an absolutely crucial part of that. I'm going to start handing over to the rest of the speakers, but thank you very much for taking the time to listen to us.